We have a portion of the rope from the noose that was used to hang Carl Panzram. We also have the blindfold cloth that actually went over his eyes.
I don't want any Bible-backed hypocrites at my funeral. Run them out, and I will go out under my own power. I don't want to cause any trouble, for I'm as anxious to get it over with as you are.
Because Warnke was murdered inside a federal prison, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had jurisdictional authority on conducting the investigation, and they determined that Carl Panzram was writing to Henry James, who they verified as being Henry Lesser.
He moved through America under different names, slipping in and out of prisons 9 times before anyone realized who they were really dealing with. A 6-foot-tall figure who left a path of violence across 3 continents in the early 20th century. On July 1928, Washington, D.C. City Jail. Guards heard a voice coming from one of the cells. The prisoner inside was talking about taking lives, multiple lives, in different cities, over many years. The guards didn't believe him. Prisoners said crazy things all the time to get attention or seem dangerous. But then they started checking his claims. The prisoner had been arrested for burglary under the name John O'Leary, but that wasn't his real identity. He'd used Jeff Davis in one city, Jack Allen in another, Teddy Bedard somewhere else. When investigators finally connected the cases, they discovered something disturbing. A young prison guard noticed this prisoner was different. Most inmates spent their time causing trouble or complaining. This one wanted to write. The guard gave him a pencil and paper. What came back wasn't letters or stories. It was a detailed autobiography. Page after page of confessions. Crimes police didn't know about. He simply wanted someone to know what he'd done. Investigators built a timeline from his writings. The pattern was chilling. But the truly disturbing part was what happened between prison sentences. During the brief periods of freedom, that's when most of the damage occurred. By the time authorities pieced together his full story, he'd admitted to at least 21 deaths. Some experts believe the real number was higher. This is the story of Carl Panzram, and it starts long before anyone knew his real name. His name was Carl Panzram, born on a failing farm near East Grand Forks, Minnesota. This child would grow into one of the most dangerous criminals America has ever produced. But on that summer day in 1891, he was just another baby. The 6th of 7 children born to Johann and Matilda Panzram, 2 East Prussian immigrants struggling to survive on American soil. The Panzram farm was a place of misery. Crops barely grew. Money was always scarce. The children worked from dawn until they collapsed at night. And young Carl, even from his earliest memories, felt different, disconnected. Angry at a world that seemed designed to crush him before he could even walk. But the real nightmare hadn't begun yet. That would come later, when his father made a decision that would change everything. When Carl was 7 years old, he woke up one morning to discover his father was gone. Johann Panzram had simply vanished, left his wife, left his 7 children, left everything behind. He never came back, never sent word, just disappeared. Now Matilda was alone with 7 mouths to feed and a farm that barely produced enough to keep them alive. The burden fell on the children. Carl, still just a small boy, was forced to work even harder. 2 hours of sleep per night, then back to the fields. School when he could, work always. Something inside Carl began to break. Or maybe it was already broken, and the abandonment just made it worse. By age 5, he was stealing. By age 8, he was lying constantly. By age 10, he felt nothing but anger. His mother couldn't control him. Nobody could. At age 12, Carl broke into a neighbor's home and stole cake, apples, and a revolver. It seemed like typical juvenile delinquency. A hungry, angry boy taking what he wanted. But this single act would seal his fate. His mother made a decision. She sent Carl to the Minnesota State Training School in Red Wing, a reform institution that promised to straighten out troubled boys. She had no idea she was sending her son to hell. The Minnesota State Training School was not a place of reform. It was a house of horrors disguised as a correction facility. And there was one place the boys feared above all others. They called it the paint shop. The name came from what happened to boys who were taken there. They came out painted in bruises and blood. Sometimes they didn't come out at all. What happened in that workshop would haunt Carl Panzram for the rest of his life, and through him would haunt the world. Staff members beat children unconscious. They forced young boys to strip. They committed acts so vile, so systematic, that the abuse amounted to organized torture. Carl was beaten with fists, with implements, with anything the staff could find. He was assaulted repeatedly. He was tortured for minor infractions, or sometimes for no reason at all, except that the adults could, and no one would stop them. The abuse was so severe, so constant, that it rewired something fundamental in Carl's brain. Whatever capacity for empathy he might have had was beaten out of him. Whatever hope for a normal life was crushed under the weight of adult cruelty. Years later, he would write with bitter clarity, "I was reformed all right. I had been taught by Christians how to be a hypocrite and a sneak. I had learned more about stealing, lying, hating, burning, and harming than I ever knew existed. I learned that a boy's body could be used for things I had never imagined. And I learned that adults could be monsters worse than anything in children's nightmares." The rage was building, growing stronger every day, and soon it would explode. On July 7th, 1905, Carl Panzram committed his first act of revenge. He successfully burned down a building at the Minnesota State Training School. He did it carefully, without detection, and watched as the place that had tortured him went up in flames. Some accounts suggest a boy died in that fire, though this was never confirmed. After being paroled in January 1906, Carl, now a teenager, ran away from home for good. He began riding freight trains across America, living the dangerous life of a hobo. During one of these train rides, he later claimed he was gang attacked by a group of other transients, an experience that left him, in his words, a sadder, sicker, but wiser boy. His hatred for humanity was growing stronger every day. In 1907, at age 15, Panzram got drunk in a Montana saloon and enlisted in the United States Army. He thought maybe military discipline would give his life structure. Instead, it gave him his first taste of Leavenworth. Panzram was rebellious, insubordinate, and refused to follow orders. When he was caught stealing $88 worth of supplies, the military came down hard. Secretary of War William Howard Taft himself approved Panzram's sentence. 3 years of hard labor at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Those 3 years broke whatever small piece of humanity Panzram had left. The guards beat him. They hung him from rafters for hours at a time. They turned water hoses on him in winter. They locked him in solitary confinement for days, sometimes weeks, with barely any food. He claimed he survived by eating cockroaches. Panzram later wrote, "I was a pretty rotten egg before I went there. But when I left there, all the good that may have been in me had been kicked and beaten out of me." He left Leavenworth in 1910 with an all-consuming hatred for William Howard Taft, specifically, and humanity in general. That hatred would soon turn deadly. Throughout the 1910s, Panzram's criminal career escalated. He committed burglaries across the western United States. He was caught, imprisoned, escaped, caught again. An endless cycle. Each time he was imprisoned, the guards subjected him to brutal treatment. Each time, his rage grew stronger. In 1915, while imprisoned at Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Panzram helped a fellow inmate named Otto Hooker escape. During the escape attempt, Hooker ended the life of Warden Minto. This marked Panzram's first connection to a case involving someone losing their life, as an accessory before the fact. Panzram himself escaped from Salem on September 18, 1917, after 61 days in solitary confinement. He shaved his mustache and began using aliases. He would never return to the Pacific Northwest. But the worst was yet to come. By 1920, Panzram would begin his true reign of terror. September 16, 1920, New Haven, Connecticut. Carl Panzram stood outside a mansion in the darkness, studying the windows, the locks, the patterns of movement inside. This wasn't just any house. This was the home of former President William Howard Taft, the same man who, years earlier, had personally approved Panzram's brutal sentence to Leavenworth. Panzram had been waiting for this moment, planning it, dreaming about it. That night, he broke in. Moving through Taft's home like a shadow, he stole thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and bonds. He took Taft's inscribed service watch, a personal trophy. But the prize he wanted most was sitting in a drawer. Taft's personal Colt M1911.45 caliber handgun. When Panzram left that mansion, he wasn't just carrying stolen goods. He was carrying the weapon of his revenge. With Taft's money, Panzram purchased a small yacht and named it the Akista. To anyone watching, he looked like a successful businessman, a captain ready to hire crew and sail the waters around New York. But the Akista wasn't a yacht. It was a floating tomb. For 3 months, Panzram haunted the bars near the New York waterfront, looking for a specific type of person. Sailors, drifters, men who wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared. Men who were down on their luck and desperate for work. Looking for crew, he'd say, buying drinks, friendly and charming. Good pay, easy work. Just need some hands on my yacht. The men would smile, shake his hand, excited for the opportunity. They had no idea they were shaking hands with their own end. Panzram would bring them to City Island in the Bronx, where the Akista was docked. Once aboard, he'd offer more drinks. Strong drinks. Keep pouring until the men were intoxicated, vulnerable, unable to fight back effectively. Then the monster would emerge. What came next on that yacht was so horrific that even Panzram's written confession, decades later, would make investigators physically ill. He would assault the men. Then, using President Taft's stolen weapon, he would end their lives. But he didn't stop there. The bodies had to disappear, and Panzram had found the perfect place, a spot in Long Island Sound called Execution Rocks Light. He would weight down the bodies and dump them in the dark waters, where the currents and sea life would do the rest. 10 sailors who walked onto the Akista looking for honest work and never walked off. 10 men who trusted the wrong person on the wrong night. But here's the terrifying truth. We may never know the real number. Bodies dumped in the ocean don't always surface. Many of Panzram's victims were drifters, men without families actively looking for them. In 1920, missing persons cases weren't tracked the way they are today. 10 confirmed by Panzram's confession. Possibly more. The spree only ended when the Akista ran aground and sank near Atlantic City, New Jersey in October 1920. Panzram's last 2 intended victims managed to escape during the chaos of the sinking. They fled into the night, confused, traumatized, having no idea how close they'd come to joining the others at the bottom of Long Island Sound. After the yacht sank and his crimes in New York reached their end, Panzram did what any smart fugitive would do. He ran. He ran to another continent. Jumping bail on various charges, Panzram stowed away on a ship bound for Africa. When he arrived in Luanda, the capital of Portuguese Angola, in late 1921, he managed to talk his way into a job with the Sinclair Oil Company. They needed a foreman for an oil drilling rig, and Panzram, using one of his many false identities, seemed qualified. But Carl Panzram couldn't control himself. Not in New York, not in Africa, not anywhere. After conflicts with his supervisor, which included burning down an entire oil rig in a fit of rage, Panzram was fired. When he found his former boss to discuss the termination, he beat the man so severely that the supervisor barely survived. Panzram was now unemployed, angry, and alone in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language and knew almost nothing about the culture. That's when he saw the boy. An Angolan child, estimated to be around 11 or 12 years old, approached Panzram. Perhaps looking for food, perhaps looking for work. Panzram took the boy to a gravel pit approximately a quarter-mile from the main road. Isolated, hidden, no witnesses. The events that occur in that gravel pit represents one of the most disturbing crimes in Panzram's entire catalog of horrors. He assaulted the child. Then, he beat the boy with such savage, relentless violence that the child's skull fractured. Panzram would later describe the scene in his confession with chilling clinical detail, noting the severity of the injuries he inflicted. The boy's body was never recovered. But Panzram wasn't done with Africa yet. Not even close. A few days after the gravel pit incident, Panzram made his way to Lobito Bay, down the coast from Luanda. There, he approached a group of local guides with an offer. "I want to hunt crocodiles," he told them through gestures and broken communication. "I'll pay you to take me into the backwaters." 6 men agreed. They had no reason to suspect anything. Foreign hunters came to Africa all the time looking for exotic game. They had no idea they were the ones being hunted. The men loaded into the canoe with Panzram and began paddling down the river, deeper into the wilderness. The water was dark, thick vegetation lined both banks, and lurking beneath the surface were the very crocodiles Panzram had supposedly come to hunt. Then, without warning, Panzram raised his weapon. 6 shots, 6 bodies. The first guide didn't even have time to turn around before the bullet entered his back. Then the second, then the third. Panzram systematically shot all 6 men in the back as they paddled, their focus on navigation, completely unaware until the shots rang out. But Panzram wasn't taking any chances. As each man fell, he moved closer and fired again. 6 men, 6 families who would never know what happened. 6 bodies that Panzram then methodically pushed into the river, where the crocodiles he'd supposedly come to hunt consumed the evidence. Panzram later wrote about this incident with disturbing pride, noting how the crocodiles devoured their bodies with gusto. He showed no remorse, no guilt. If anything, he seemed to relish the memory. And then he wrote something even more chilling. To someone of average intelligence, ending the lives of 6 at once seems almost impossible. It was very much easier for me to eliminate those 6 men than it was to harm even one of the young boys I ended later. Some of them were only 11 or 12 years old, and they fought back harder. Think about that for a moment. 6 grown men were easier to destroy than children. Not because he had moral qualms, but because children fought harder for their lives. This wasn't just violence. This was systematic extermination carried out by someone who had completely dehumanized every person on Earth, including himself. When Panzram returned to the United States in 1922, Portuguese authorities were already looking for him. He had to carefully slip back into the country, but once home, he resumed his pattern of violence. Between 1922 and 1928, Panzram continued his crimes across the East Coast. He later confessed to ending the lives of 2 more young boys during this period. In July 1922, he beat a boy to death with a rock in Salem, Massachusetts. Later that year, he strangled another boy near New Haven, Connecticut. The Connecticut victim was found in August 1923. A young man estimated to be about 20 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 150 pounds, wearing a striped brown suit with a chauffeur's cap. He had been strangled with a belt drawn tightly around his neck. A handkerchief stuffed with cotton had been tied around his mouth. 2 wounds on his chest, initially thought to be from a weapon, were later determined to be injuries from Panzram's shoes as he held the victim down. Panzram was also arrested for burglary in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he served 6 months. While there, he got involved in a maritime union strike that turned violent. After a gun battle with police, he jumped bail and went on the run again. During this period, Panzram became obsessed with the idea of becoming a professional hitman. He still had the weapon he'd used in the Angola incidents, and in 1922, he had it fitted with a silencer by the Maxim Silent Firearms Company in Hartford, Connecticut. He eagerly tested the device, imagining a lucrative career-ending lives for money. But the silencer didn't work as promised. The weapon still made considerable noise. Panzram was deeply disappointed. "If that heavy caliber pistol and the silencer had only worked as I thought it would," he wrote later, "I would have gone into the business of ending lives on a wholesale scale. The thought is terrifying. An already prolific offender fantasizing about eliminating people for profit, disappointed only by faulty equipment." On August 16, 1928, Carl Panzram was arrested in Washington, D.C., following a string of burglaries. During his interrogation, Panzram voluntarily confessed to ending the lives of 2 boys. Investigators were stunned. Given his extensive criminal record and these confessions, Panzram was sentenced to 25 years to life at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, the same prison where his hatred had been forged 2 decades earlier. When Panzram arrived at Leavenworth in early 1929, he immediately told the warden, "I'll end the life of the first man that bothers me." Prison officials decided to give him a job where he could work alone, in the prison laundry, under civilian supervisor Robert Warnke. Warnke was a quiet, well-liked 47-year-old from Cleveland who had worked at Leavenworth for 8 years. There seemed to be no reason for conflict, but Panzram had warned them, and he kept his word. Robert Warnke woke up that morning like he had for thousands of mornings before. He kissed his wife goodbye. He thought about his son. He put on his work clothes and headed to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, where he'd worked as a civilian laundry foreman for 8 years. He was a good man, quiet, kind, never harsh with the inmates, never cruel. In a prison full of violence and anger, Robert Warnke was one of the few people who treated the inmates like human beings. But none of that would matter. Because Carl Panzram had made a promise when he arrived at Leavenworth. I'll end the life of the first man that bothers me. And in Panzram's twisted mind, Robert Warnke had bothered him. The laundry room was quiet when Warnke arrived that morning. A few inmates were already working at their stations. One of them was Panzram, the prisoner everyone knew was dangerous, the one with the dark eyes and the constant rage simmering just below the surface. Leaning casually against the door was a 4-foot iron bar. It was used as a support for wooden transport crates, heavy, solid, brutal. Panzram had noticed it days earlier, maybe weeks. He'd been thinking about it, planning. Warnke walked to his usual spot and began preparing paperwork for the day's work assignments. His back was to Panzram. He was completely unaware of what was about to happen. Panzram stood up. He walked calmly toward the iron bar. His movements were deliberate, controlled. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated, calculated. He picked up the bar. The weight felt good in his hands. He approached Warnke from behind. What followed after that took maybe 15 seconds. Panzram raised the iron bar and brought it down directly onto Warnke's skull. The sound was sickening. Warnke crumpled, but Panzram didn't stop. He hit him again and again. Evidence sprayed across the walls and floor. Other inmates screamed and backed away in horror. Then Panzram turned on them. "Since I've already harmed one," he shouted, swinging the bar, "I might as well eliminate all of you." Prisoners ran for their lives. The general alarm blared. Dozens of guards with weapons sprinted toward the laundry. When they looked through the barred windows, they saw a scene from a nightmare. The room was destroyed, evidence everywhere. And standing in the center was Carl Panzram, drenched in crimson, still holding the iron bar. Robert Warnke lay motionless behind him. "Let me in." The guards aimed their weapons. "Drop it now." Panzram looked at them. Then something shifted in his eyes. Not remorse, satisfaction. "I just ended Warnke's life," he said calmly. "Let me in." The guards refused until he dropped the bar. He smiled. "Oh, I guess this is my lucky day." He dropped it. Robert Warnke, the foreman who had only tried to do his job, was gone. He left behind a wife and son. Panzram was placed in isolation, but he wasn't worried. He knew exactly where this was heading, and he welcomed it. Before his transfer to Leavenworth, Panzram had met a young prison guard named Henry Lesser in the Washington, D.C. jail. Lesser was just 26 years old. Unlike every other authority figure in Panzram's life, Lesser showed him kindness. When he heard about brutal treatment Panzram endured, Lesser felt genuine sympathy. One day, Lesser slipped Panzram $1 for cigarettes and food. "No one had ever been kind to me in my entire life," Panzram later told Lesser. The two formed an unlikely friendship that continued through letters even after Panzram's transfer. After Panzram ended Warnke's life and was sentenced to death, Lesser provided him with pencils and paper, convincing the condemned man to write his life story. Over several months in 1929 and 1930, Panzram wrote more than 40,000 words, documenting his entire criminal career in shocking detail. He spared nothing. He described his crimes with cold precision. He explained his philosophy of hatred. "In my lifetime, I have taken the lives of 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed violent crimes against more than 1,000 males of all ages," he began. "For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry. I have no conscience, so that does not worry me. I don't believe in man, God, nor devil. I hate the whole human race, including myself. He ended with his personal motto: rob 'em all, assault 'em all, and harm 'em all. Fighting for death. When activists and death penalty opponents learned of Panzram's case and attempted to appeal his sentence, Panzram was furious. The only thanks you and your kind will ever get from me for your efforts on my behalf is that I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it, he wrote to the Society for the Abolishment of Capital Punishment. He even wrote to President Herbert Hoover, I am sane, and I know what I did. I deserve to be executed. Do not stop it. Panzram wanted to face the consequences, not out of remorse, but because he believed execution was the only fitting end for someone like him. After being convicted, Carl Panzram was moved to death row at Leavenworth. His execution date was set for September 5, 1930. Most condemned prisoners spend their final weeks in prayer or regret. Panzram fought anyone who tried to save him, writing scathing letters demanding they stop interfering. Think about that. A man on death row fighting to make sure he would be executed, not out of remorse, but because he genuinely believed he deserved it, or perhaps because he simply wanted it to end. September 4th, 1930. Panzram's last night alive. Robert Stroud, the famous Birdman of Alcatraz, was also on death row at Leavenworth. He later wrote about Panzram's final hours. All night long that last night he walked the floor of his cell, Stroud recalled, never stopping, just pacing and singing. Guards reported hearing Panzram singing a crude, violent song, something about hatred and death and his own twisted philosophy. He paced back and forth like a caged animal, singing in the darkness. He didn't sleep, didn't pray, didn't show fear or regret. He just waited. The sun hadn't risen when the guards came for Carl Panzram. He stepped out without hesitation. No struggle, no panic. 2 U.S. Marshals escorted him toward the execution chamber. They led him outside to the gallows, 13 steps leading up to a platform. The noose hung from above, swaying in the morning breeze. Panzram looked at it. Then he started walking. He climbed those steps with his teeth clenched, his face set in defiance. No trembling, no hesitation. When he reached the platform, they attempted to place a black hood over his head. But Carl Panzram wasn't going out quietly. He suddenly turned and spat directly in the executioner's face. One final act of contempt. Then he spoke his final words. Words that would be quoted for nearly a century. Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could end the lives of a dozen men while you're fooling around. Even facing the noose, even seconds from death, Carl Panzram was threatening violence. The trapdoor opened. The noose snapped tight. Carl Panzram's neck broke instantly. At 6:30 a.m. on September 5th, 1930, Carl Panzram was declared deceased. He was 39 years old. He had spent nearly half his life in prisons, the other half destroying as many lives as possible. No one claimed Panzram's body, no family, no friends, nobody. Prison staff loaded his corpse into a wheelbarrow and wheeled him to the prison cemetery. They buried him in an unmarked grave. No headstone, no name, just a number, 31,614. That's how Carl Panzram left this world, alone, unmourned, reduced to a number, exactly as he had predicted, exactly as he wanted. Henry Lesser kept Panzram's manuscript for 4 decades. Finally, in 1970, 40 years after Panzram's execution, the autobiography was published under the title Killer, A Journal of Murder. The book shocked readers and criminologists. Here was a complete, unfiltered look into the mind of someone who truly hated humanity. Dr. Carl Menninger, the famous psychiatrist, described Panzram as the logical product of the American prison system, a man created by systematic abuse and brutality. Lesser dedicated the rest of his life to prison reform, using Panzram's story as a cautionary tale. In 1980, he donated Panzram's original manuscript to San Diego State University, where it remains today as the Carl Panzram Papers. Carl Panzram confessed to ending 21 lives. That's the official number. But nobody believes that number. Think about it. Panzram operated for nearly 20 years across multiple continents, using over a dozen aliases. He moved constantly, always one step ahead of the law. Authorities confirmed only 5 deaths with absolute certainty. Robert Warnke at Leavenworth, Henry McMahon in Massachusetts, an unidentified young man near New Haven, Warden Minto as an accessory, 1 yacht victim identified from dental records, 5 confirmed, 16 mentioned in his confession but never verified. But what about the ones he didn't confess to? The 10 sailors dumped in Long Island Sound, most never identified. The 6 guides in Angola, fed to crocodiles, no investigation ever conducted. The boy in the gravel pit, never identified, never found. And those are just from his confession. What about crimes Panzram didn't bother documenting? Some criminologists believe the real number could exceed 100 victims. He claimed to have assaulted over 1,000 people. If even 10% of those assaults turned deadly, that's 100 victims. He traveled constantly: Minnesota, Oregon, Washington, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, Angola, and countless places between. He had nearly 2 decades of freedom between reform school and his final arrest. Bodies dumped in oceans, remains fed to animals, victims in remote locations. In the 1910s and 1920s, before modern forensics, people could simply vanish. And Panzram knew it. When Killer, a Journal of Murder, was published in 1970, it shocked the nation again. Here was a complete confession from one of history's most dangerous criminals. No lawyer editing his words, just raw, brutal honesty. Dr. Menninger believed Panzram had been created by the very institutions designed to reform him. The abuse at reform school, the severe mistreatment at Leavenworth, the systematic brutality of early 20th century prisons had taken a troubled boy and manufactured a monster. But even Menninger admitted Panzram was an extreme case. Most people subjected to similar abuse didn't become mass offenders. There was something in Panzram himself that made him particularly susceptible. Or perhaps, as Panzram believed, he was simply born wrong. Henry Lesser dedicated his life to prison reform. He would tell audiences, 1 act of kindness, $1 for cigarettes, and Carl Panzram was willing to confess everything. Imagine what might have happened if someone had shown him kindness when he was 12. But Lesser never made excuses for what Panzram did. He understood that Panzram made choices, horrible, evil choices, that nothing could justify. Researchers still study the Carl Panzram papers at San Diego State University, trying to understand how someone becomes so consumed by hatred that they declare war on the entire human race. They're still looking for answers. If you visit Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary today, you can find the prison cemetery. Row after row of simple markers, most bearing only numbers. Somewhere in that cemetery is grave number 31,614. No name, no dates, no epitaph. Just a number marking where Carl Panzram's body was buried after nobody claimed it. But his victims deserve to be remembered. Robert Warnke, who left behind a wife and son. The sailors who thought they'd found honest work. The boy in Angola whose name we'll never know. The 6 guides whose families never learned their fate. They all had names. They all had families. They all had futures that Carl Panzram stole from them. And somewhere, perhaps, there are other victims we don't even know about yet. The ocean keeps its secrets. The crocodiles told no tales, and Carl Panzram is gone, taking whatever remained of his dark secrets with him to that unmarked grave. The only thing we know for certain is this: 21 confirmed victims is almost certainly not the whole story. The real number? That died with him. Carl Panzram's story stands as a dark reminder of how cycles of violence can create unimaginable evil. If this story impacted you, please share this video to spread awareness about the devastating effects of systematic abuse and the importance of intervention. Subscribe to stay informed about true crime cases that teach us vital lessons about society and safety. Together, we can work toward a world where fewer Carl Panzrams are created.